I'd like to begin my talk today by taking you back to 1953, at the height of the Cold War. It was a time when in the United States, McCarthyism was very much still part of the cultural currency. American society and culture had been gripped by a fear of communism. The Soviet possession of the atomic bomb only added to this deep anxiety. At home, a few public intellectuals such as Arthur Miller and Edward R. Murrow had begun to voice their reservations about the indiscriminate accusations of disloyalty and treason that dogged many American citizens, both prominent and otherwise. University professors had been particularly divided over the supposed communist influence in American society. Spurred by what they perceived as the spread of socialist ideology, some formed the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a body that held conferences, published journals, and sought to establish an international anti-communist consensus among Western intellectuals. In 1953, this Congress held a well-publicized international meeting in Hamburg on the topic of science and freedom. Attending were many Nobel laureates, physicists, chemists, and philosophers. In his opening address, Hamburg Mayor Max Brauer emphatically noted that, quote, "No scientific discipline can possibly develop its full potentialities when science and learning are forced into a condition of dependence upon some overriding authority. Every subjection of science destroys the progress of science," end of quote. The backdrop for such claims was news of the so-called Lysenko affair, which profoundly shifted the Western conception of science in the Soviet Union. Trofim Lysenko, a lowly agronomist, rose rapidly through the ranks of the Soviet scientific community after he began to advance a solution to chronic agricultural problems. He suggested that plants could evolve through the inheritance of acquired characteristics, a process that had been long rejected by modern-day geneticists. Lysenko, who came from modest proletarian beginnings, was an ideal poster child for the Stalinist cause. He muscled his way to the apex of Soviet science as genetics was stigmatized as, quote, a bourgeois pseudoscience. Many geneticists were fired from their jobs, some were arrested, and a few were even shot. In many ways, Lysenkoism was a disaster for Soviet biology. Perhaps not surprisingly, Westerners began to see all Soviet science as exemplifying the negative and destructive influence that state-sponsored ideologies can wreak on science. Seeing Lysenko as a critical test case, speakers at the aforementioned conference in Hamburg divided the practice of science into the technically inferior totalitarian version and the noble and progressive free variant. Contemporary social scientists spoke of the Republic of Science, a place where scientists and science prospered with the free flow of information, where priorities were not set by the state nor dictated by ideology. Besides solidifying the dichotomy between totalitarian and free science, the Lysenko episode was also useful to philosophers and sociologists of science. Ever since the birth of the history of science as a discipline, scholars had seen scientific inquiry as independent of social and cultural context. In other words, science was simply a collection of facts, and different individuals or communities or cultures or nations might approach and solve problems in different ways, but the optimal solution to a specific scientific problem was always the same, because at its core, science depended on a set of objective axioms. But by the 1960s and 70s, a number of sociologists of science began to seriously challenge this worldview, arguing that not just the practice of science, but the actual content of science was relative, arguing that and dependent on a variety of social and cultural factors. Thus, the particular nature of Newtonian science merely reflected a set of social and cultural factors of the context of emerging capitalist relations in England. Scientists considered any set of given facts true only because those facts fit well with prevailing social and cultural codes. This approach to understanding the history of science, called the social constructivist vision of science, was particularly reflected in the overtly Marxist, repressive, and anti-intellectual proclivities of the Communist Party. In other words, the poor showing of Soviet science could be explained away by social factors, particularly the influence of ideology on science. Historians of science relished the Lysenko affair, for it confirmed their unstated impressions that ideological interference was the root cause of the poverty of Soviet science. Their positions made them natural allies for Cold Warriors who saw nothing but mediocrity in Soviet science. But then things began to change. In 1953, the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb, developed entirely indigenously. In 1957, the Soviet scientists launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. And in 1965, they completely disavowed Lysenko and re-embraced modern genetics. If, as social scientists seem to suggest, that the failings of Soviet science could be explained by the notion that the social context of Soviet science impeded progress, then one also had to argue by symmetry that Soviet social conditions allowed and in fact enabled these aforementioned successes. In other words, Soviet successes in science and technology raised all sorts of thorny issues, both for social scientists and for anti-communist activists, two groups who sometimes overlapped, as they did with the aforementioned Congress for Cultural Freedom. This problem to explain the successes of Soviet science, and in particular the relationship between science and freedom, has framed my current research. But the catalyst for the research was serendipitous. In Moscow a few years ago, to do research on another project, I was at the end of my workday at a major archive. Leafing through a folder, which at the time seemed inconsequential, I found some documents about a special technical bureau in Moscow in the 1930s and 40s, which housed a unique category of prisoners. As I leafed through the papers, I realized I had stumbled onto documents on one of the most unusual experiments in scientific activity in the 20th century, the creation and maintenance of prison camps specifically designed to hold scientists and engineers. What was the purpose of these camps? To force scientists to work in isolation to produce innovations. Knowledge of this phenomenon was not new, to me at least. Already in the late 1960s, the famous Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn had published his novel In the First Circle about a similar prison on the outskirts of Moscow where Russian scientists lived and worked in isolation. Semi-autobiographical in nature, this was a morally complex tale about a dozen or so scientists and engineers imprisoned in a penal colony in the Soviet Gulag who struggled to find a middle ground between conscience and ideology. Solzhenitsyn's acerbic and ironic style brought to life a lost episode, albeit through fiction, of Soviet intelligentsia. Further information about this peculiar prison science system emerged in the early 1970s, but it was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union that historians had a deeper sense of its place in Soviet society. My goal here today is not simply to recover an ostensibly lost history of the prison science system, but also to offer some observations about the relationship between science and freedom, a question that can also be posed in the reverse. Can science operate under great stress? During the very time period when the Soviet Union was building the world's largest scientific establishment and conducting research at the cutting edge of many different fields, such as mathematics, astronomy, solid-state chemistry, plasma physics, theoretical seismology, climate research, astrophysics, it was also persecuting its scientists and engineers mercilessly. No field of knowledge was spared. Some historians estimate that about half of the engineers in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s were arrested. The prison science system, whose existence spanned a quarter of a century, from the late 1920s to the time of Stalin's death in 1953, was one symptom of this phenomenon. So, let me begin the heart of my talk with a biography. I'd like to take you through the creation and operation of the prison science system by focusing on one man, a relatively average engineer, at least early in his life, whose fate was emblematic of a whole generation of Soviet scientists. By highlighting the life of this typical engineer, my hope is that you might get a sense of the human scope of the operation of science under stress. And at key points, I will depart from his biography to give you a feeling for the nature, scale, and achievements of Soviet science. The man I chose was one Sergey Pavlovich Korolyov, a young man, he turned 30 in 1936, who was both unremarkable and remarkable. The former because the fortunes of his life through the Stalinist system was replicated by tens of thousands of others, the latter because he managed to transcend it in unusual ways. Korolyov's life perfectly embodied and eerily mirrored all the contradictions of Soviet science. He had been born to a family of working intelligentsia in Ukraine in 1906. After the revolution in 1917, inspired by the Bolsheviks' promotion of aviation, Korolev became passionately interested in aeronautics, often to the great displeasure of his parents who considered it a useless hobby. At 17, he joined a glider club in Odessa and eventually became its leader. As a student at Moscow University in the late 1920s, he studied aeromechanics and did an internship at a large airplane factory. For his diploma project, Korolev studied under the famed Russian airplane designer Andrei Tupolev, considered to this day the patriarch of Soviet aviation. And you see Korolev on the left, on the picture on the right, with one of the gliders that he designed himself. That picture is from 1929. Rising through the ranks of a research institute, Korolev pursued his passions to install a rocket engine at the tail end of an airplane, a contraption that he called a rocket plane. This was the team that helped him build these airplanes. Through the 1930s, he wrote widely, attended conferences, developed his design for the rocket plane, and became well known in his small field. All that came to a crashing standstill in 1938 when the Stalinist purges consumed Soviet society. For those who need refreshing, the purges under Stalin, the Great Terror, named as an echo of the Reign of Terror under Robespierre, peaked in 1937 and 1938. It decimated an entire generation of the best intellectuals in the Soviet Union. First, they came for the military officers, then the Communist Party leaders, then the intelligentsia, then various ethnic minorities, until all levels of society were caught in the whirlwind of indiscriminate repressions that seemed to defy logic and reason. At the height of the terror, almost every branch of Soviet science and technology was affected. In the aviation industry alone, almost every major aviation designer ended up in prison. In one major aviation factory specializing in engines, at least 1,000 people were arrested, including the director, the deputy director, and the chief mechanic. Many were executed. In this world of insanity, logic was at a premium. One could be arrested for being insufficiently vigilant against enemies of the state, or one could be arrested for being too vigilant. You could be in danger if you knew somebody who had already been arrested. You could be arrested for not knowing about the anti-state activities of those who had been arrested. Korolev, then a mid-level engineer at a relatively average institute, had the misfortune of knowing a number of people who had been declared, quote-unquote, enemies of the state. In the winter of 1937, 3 of the top leaders of his institute had already disappeared. By this time, he was a marked man. Slowly, fellow engineers began to avoid him at work, as if he was the plague. With one faithful colleague who refused to be cowed, Korolev continued to work on his project. Then on Monday, June 27, 1938, something quite unremarkable for the times happened. After a long day at work, Korolev walked home to his tiny one-room Moscow apartment in a drab 5-story building near the US Embassy. On his way home, he picked up some fresh French bread and a copy of Pravda. Korolev's 3-year-old daughter, Natalia, had been sent away to her grandmother's country house, so the apartment was unusually quiet that night. This is his wife and his daughter. His wife, Senia, a medical student, had noticed 2 men in dark suits lurking nearby when she returned from work. Several people from her building had disappeared in the past few months. After supper, as the 2 sat listening to music on their new phonograph, the doorbell rang. They both immediately sensed what was about to happen. 2 men from the Soviet security services walked in and directed Korolev to sit down while they searched the apartment. Then, as Xenia, his wife, later remembered, they told Sergei Pavlovich to get dressed. He put on a leather coat he usually wore. I naively gave him 2 changes of underwear for the journey. We said goodbye and kissed each other. But when I wanted to go downstairs to see him off in the car, they prevented me quite roughly. I remained alone in the flat. I had golden hair, and it went completely gray overnight. In at least one interrogation, Korolev succumbed to brutal torture and admitted that he had been a member of, quote-unquote, an anti-Soviet organization. The interrogators broke his upper and lower jaw so badly that later in his life, he grew to dislike visits to the dentist because he was never able to fully open his mouth. 3 months after his arrest and after prolonged torture, the security services placed him on a death list, along with 73 others for immediate execution. Stalin, Molotov, and Voroshilov personally signed this list. 2 days later, 59 persons from the roster were shot at a holding center on the Kaluga main road in Moscow. At the very last minute, for reasons still unclear, the police spared Korolev and a few others. Instead of execution, Korolev was brought in front of the judge, and after a 15-minute deliberation, sentenced to 10 years imprisonment with 5 years of deprivation of political rights. His lesser sentence meant that he would be sent to a hard labor camp in the far eastern Soviet Union. Sometime in mid-1939, Korolev was dispatched to Vladivostok on the Siberian coast to begin his term of hard labor at one of the most notorious and horrific gulag camps in the Kalima region. He was now, for all intents and purposes, a gold miner, and an unpaid one at that. The Soviet government operated about 50 such gold mines in eastern Siberia. Prisoners would arrive here after a perilous crossing over the Sea of Okhotsk, and then be sent to camps scattered throughout the vast mining infrastructure along the Kalima River. In 1939, the inmate population numbered close to 70,000, composed of both political prisoners and hardened ordinary criminals. Of the camps of the Gulag system, the ones at Kalima were undoubtedly the most feared. One former prisoner of the complex later remembered, quote, the complete contempt for people, for the most elementary human rights, and often for human life as well, was evident, end of quote. conditions were abysmal, and camp superintendents did not expect prisoners to work at optimum levels for more than 3 months at best. Korolev, the consummate engineer proud of his engineering skills, arrived here in July 1939, along with 5,000 new prisoners. He was assigned to work at a camp about only 300 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. Summer soon turned to one of the worst winters on record. In the first few months, he was so brutally treated that he was left with a huge scar on his head and lost 14 of his teeth from scurvy. His single communication back to his old life was a lengthy handwritten letter smuggled out of the camp and addressed to a judge requesting a retrial. He wrote, "I have been here for already 15 months and been torn away from my life's work, which has filled my whole life and was its sustenance and goal. I dreamt of creating the first technological super high-speed aircraft for the USSR. I appeal for a review of my case and to remove my name from the profound charges of which I am absolutely not guilty." Remarkably, through an amazing set of serendipitous circumstances, a lowly clerk decided on a whim to grant him a retrial. Freed from the camp, Korolev made the 600-kilometer journey on his own by walking and hitching rides to the port city of Magadan to catch the next ship out. He was under a deadline as the review period for his case would expire if he was not back in Moscow in time. He was crushed when he missed the departing vessel. But he had reason to thank his fortunes when he learned that the ship, a steamer named Indigirka, ran aground in the Sea of Okhotsk and killed all 700 people on board. His health was so frail by this time that he made it onto the next ship, and the doctors basically left him for dead on the deck of the ship. Luckily, an unknown woman took pity on him and nursed him back to life. Korolev finally arrived back in Moscow in February 1940. 5 months later, to his shock, the result of the repeat investigation shattered his spirit. He was sentenced once again to 8 years in a labor camp. He would be expected to leave for another camp where he helped to build railways in the bitter terrain of northern Russia. Before I go on with this story, I need to take a brief interlude and fill in a little of the broader context. Korolev was one of many thousands of scientists and engineers who suffered similar fates. But why did Stalin and his lieutenants so viciously attack their scientific brain trust, even if they clearly recognized that scientists were necessary to modernize the state? How were scientists and engineers seen by the Bolsheviks, and what was the role of science in this new socialist state? Here, let me go back to 1917. From the very beginning of the Soviet era, in the years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the relationship between the political elite and the scientific and technical elite was fraught with tension. On the one hand, Bolshevik party leaders such as Lenin, Bukharin, and Trotsky recognized that scientists and engineers would be indispensable to modernizing Russia. And they made a lot of posters about it, about how technology and aviation in particular could modernize Russia. On the other hand, there was a deep suspicion of the scientific and technical intelligentsia because they represented all that the revolution promised to destroy. They were bourgeois, they were elitists, they had a proclivity for academic concerns removed from the practicalities of the day. Such tension produced in the Bolsheviks a feeling of vulnerability as more and more scientists and engineers became entrenched in key positions in the Soviet economy. So the Soviet leadership used two strategies to resolve the tension. First, they threw many of these old specialists into jail. And second, they began to train a new generation of so-called red specialists who would be younger and more loyal to the demands of the Bolshevik era. The two options of repression of the old guys and recruitment of the new ones were effective, at least at first, but raised a secondary set of problems. It would take time to train the new loyal generation. In the short term, the country lacked capable scientists and engineers to contribute to the needs of industrialization. So here was the obvious solution. Why not put the ones in jail to work? Using skilled labor under guard for new projects, especially ones that required design supervision, offered a highly effective solution to the problem. In the late 1920s, the secret police began to implement their strategy within the Soviet aviation industry, but the practice and the precedents established there quickly spread to most other sectors of the Soviet economy. The practice was abandoned by the mid-30s until calls to reestablish a prison system for scientists came from a most unlikely source. After the Great Terror, thousands of scientists and engineers were languishing in prisons, victims of a paranoid security state. But sometime in late 1937, as a large number of incarcerated prominent aviation designers awaited sentencing at the infamous Lubyanka prison, some of them had an idea. Fearing that they would inevitably be sent to forced manual labor camps in Siberia, the authors said that they could build a number of specific military systems if given the resources. They sent the letter directly to a top defense industry manager. The proposal eventually reached all the way up to the desk of one Lavrenti Beria, the infamous and feared chief of the Soviet secret police. Both a notorious sadist and a highly practical manager, Beria liked the idea. He recognized that the waves of arrests during the Great Terror had so profoundly disrupted the functioning of scientific and technical organizations that some corrective work was required to bring the situation under control. In other words, the secret police needed to create a new institution to limit the damage of their own doing. This new institution was a vast network of prison science camps, which would be a part of the Gulag, where incarcerated scientists and engineers could be put to work. Under Beria's leadership, the secret police began rounding up designers, engineers, scientists in prison for research work under a special department. In determining the content of the work of the organization, Beria took into account proposals from the prisoners, but the final approval was his. Beria's intervention ensured that the new organization, which was given the premises of an entire factory, had the best resources available, including a staggering nearly 40 million rubles as its first in financial disbursement. Within a short time, practically every prison in Moscow had a scientific group working within. And probably the most famous and well-funded group worked under the patriarch of the Soviet aviation industry, Andrei Tupolev, who himself had been arrested in 1937 for being, quote, the head of an anti-Soviet wrecking organization and an agent of French intelligence. So by mid-1939, several thousand men and women constituted the seed of the prison science system and included the cream of the crop of many different scientific and technical fields. Although they had been arrested on the usual charges of spying and counter-revolutionary activities, most had been moved to this organization before they could be sentenced. And on the matter of jail sentences, Beria displayed his marked coldness. In informing Stalin as to why it would be pointless to try these scientists and bring and engineers in courts, he wrote, quote, to investigate the confined engineers and transferring them to trial is inadvisable, since firstly, this will distract the specialists from their work. And secondly, the investigations will not give positive results because the arrested, having been mutually associated for a long time during of their work, may have agreed between themselves on the nature of their testimonies for any future investigations. End of quote. Instead, without the usual formalities of a trial, Beria divided the prisoners into three categories of confinement with 10, 15, and 20-year sentences. He proposed that the promise of shorter sentences should be used to encourage prisoners to work harder. The conditions in the Prison Design Bureau was far better than either Siberian labor camps or standard prisons. This actually shows one of the most famous prison science installations, which is actually on the outskirts of Moscow. This is just one corner of an extremely vast complex on Radio Street in Moscow. When prisoners arrived, they could hardly believe their eyes. Rumor has it that Tupolev, the giant of Soviet aviation, had arrived at their prison camp carrying a ragged, empty bag, a piece of bread, and a few pieces of sugar, all of which he adamantly refused to give up, even when told that there would be well-rounded meals. For Tupolev's team of aviation designers, work days usually began at 9 in the morning and lasted until 7 with a 1-hour lunch. During World War II, prisoners labored until midnight. They worked on the top 3 floors of a building on Radio Street that also had 3 large dorm rooms where the several hundred prisoners slept, eventually becoming several thousand. Prisoners were allowed to go for walks in the building's enclosed roof, which they called the monkey cage. The engineers remained constantly under the armed guard at all times, had their conversations monitored, and were never left alone except for sleeping at night. All the windows and doors of the building were, of course, barred up. By most accounts, the most difficult aspect of the incarceration was the permanent and total isolation from the outside. Information about everything beyond their walls was fully controlled. The social structure was complicated to a degree by the presence of civilian or free specialists who were junior to the prisoners but were able to go home at the end of the day. The Prison Science Bureau played a critical role in the fate of Sergey Korolyov, the main actor of our story, who last we had left in a prison in Moscow awaiting transport to another mining camp in the Arctic Circle. A strange turn of events saved his life. In 1939, the Soviet police asked Tupolev, head of the largest prison science camp, to compile a list of jailed engineers whom he thought would be useful for his little organization. Remembering Korolev as a bright young student from his days as a college professor, Tupolev put Korolev's name on his list, and he gave it to the secret police. A year later, while Korolev was waiting for relocation to the Arctic, to his surprise, the security services handcuffed him and put him not on a train to a mining labor camp, but in a police van to Tupolev's prison science complex just outside of Moscow. According to one contemporary, Korolev, quote, looked terrible. He was emaciated and exhausted. Such interventions were not only quite common, but became the principal method for recruiting new inmates into the prison science system. Already incarcerated scientists played a dangerous game in responding to police requests for more scientists, since they had no idea whether their colleagues were free or not. By putting a man's name, and usually it was men, on a list, they could either be snatching him from further horrors at a hard labor camp in Siberia, or sentencing him to prison, or worse, death, if he was at that point a free citizen in gainful employment elsewhere. So, skipping ahead a bit, by the end of World War II, the bulk of the formal prison science system was dismantled. In a letter to Stalin, Beria justified the seemingly abrupt release of these men, not because the system had failed to produce anything, but because apparently the system had succeeded so well that there was no longer any need to maintain it. He noted, quote, considering the importance of the work carried out, the security services considers it advisable to free these distinguished incarcerated scientists and direct them to work in industry, end of quote. By the time of the system's complete and utter dissolution in the early 1950s, many thousands of people had passed through it. Was this scientific and engineering work effective? Was it productive? For the most part, the wartime prison science system was highly successful in generating innovations to support the war effort. Extremely tight control, narrowly focused goals, and high levels of funding led engineers to achieve their targeted goals. Judging by a summary report issued in 1944, the Soviet security services believed that the results were overwhelmingly positive. This was a successful experiment. In the report, the police agents listed 20 major weapon systems or processes developed by prisoners. Of these, at least 12 were introduced into mass production. The successes of the prison science system were noteworthy. Designer Petlyakov's group developed the Pe-2 bomber, one of the most successful Soviet weapons in World War II, of which 11,000 were produced during the war. Similarly, Tupolev's team produced the Tu-2 bomber, which was an important asset to the Red Air Force and remained in service until the 1950s. The incarcerated groups also contributed to important industrial innovations by introducing newer and more efficient production processes. Their concluding report noted, quote, as a result of the many measures introduced and proposed by these imprisoned scientists and realized at various factories, many millions of rubles of state economic resources have been saved, end of quote. What motivated so many scientists and engineers to diligently work in the prison system? Certainly coercion was a big factor, but Soviet secret police bureaucrats quickly learned that coercion alone was often ineffective, usually very expensive, and needed to be combined with material incentives. And in 1948, the Gulag administration actually introduced wages into their economy. Through various periods, the secret police also offered workday credits to selected scientists and engineers. These credits essentially promised to reduce an individual's sentence by 2 days or more for every day that they overfilled a production norm. Despite these relatively radical measures, as the prison science system began to become a mature institution, overall labor productivity continued its slow decline into the early 1950s. In other words, while coercion and incentive motivated prisoners to work, they did not have any substantial effect on work productivity or creativity. With the death of Stalin in 1953, the gross economic inefficiencies of the Gulag system, especially its absurdly inefficient system of forced manual labor, could no longer be ignored. A little over 3 weeks after Stalin's death on March 30th, 1953, the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs dismantled its infamous 4th Department for the prison science camps. The system as a historical phenomenon within the the system as a phenomena within the Soviet system was consigned to history. So, some conclusions. Why did the Soviet Union create a system of camps designed to hold and force scientists and engineers to work in isolation? We must look for broad contextual explanations for the foundations of such a phenomenon. This system of science was clearly a response to mass social trauma caused by the secret police's attack on Soviet civil society. The immense pressures of these purges in the form of mass incarceration frequently disrupted important economic activities. that is, the very activity that the Gulag was supposed to strengthen. As a short-term solution to the problem that they themselves created, the security services put to work scientists and engineers in prisons. The goal was to stabilize sectors of the economy which had been rendered unstable. The solution, the prison science system, was itself inherently unstable, primarily because of two interconnected characteristics of the system: the use of a mixed free and incarcerated labor force, and the struggle to enforce secrecy. The former made the latter undeniably difficult, while the latter significantly raised the hidden costs of the system, raising important questions about efficiency and productivity. Given these circumstances, dissolving the system at the time of Stalin's death made as much economic as moral sense. In other words, the prison science system was productive in the short term, but outlived its usefulness the longer it existed. By 1953, it had become completely stagnant. So let us return to our original question about science and freedom. In 1952, in anticipation of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Harvard University President James B. Conant noted that, quote, "Science and the assumptions behind our politics are compatible. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, the tradition of science is diametrically opposed to the official philosophy of the REM," end of quote. In answer to the question, is freedom necessary for productive and scientific and engineering activity to occur, he answered in an unequivocal negative. But there is now compelling evidence to complicate this question. The unfortunate answer from the Soviet case would seem to be no, one does not need to have freedom. In other words, science can operate and even flourish under great social and political oppression, as it did under Stalinism. It cannot flourish for very long, but it can produce extraordinary achievements, as did the prison science system, as did the scientists who used hard labor to build the first hydrogen bomb, as did the scientists who produced significant innovations under the threat of arrest and even death. But such science also leaves an undeniably horrific human cost. The thousands of lives lost, the institutions disbanded, the disciplines suspended, all as one comprise an extraordinarily depressing record of possibilities interrupted. Science may indeed operate without freedom, but it is a costly path to take. There are deeply troubling implications here. Even as Stalinist science flourished and suffered and flourished, it bequeathed an enduring legacy, and we see this legacy manifested in the aftermath of the prison science system. Let me give you some examples. Because the recruitment into the Gulag prison science system worked with the personal intervention of prisoners who remembered their friends, the system as a whole produced a host of Soviet scientists and engineers who shared an enormous trauma that deeply affected their lives. An entire generation of elite engineers and scientists who were arrested went on to head their own design and engineering firms in the post-Stalin era. As a group, they dominated research and development, especially within the Soviet military-industrial complex, a sector that propped up Soviet political might throughout much of the Cold War. Their adoption and occasional enthusiasm for certain traits of the organizational culture of the prison science system, extreme secrecy, strict hierarchies, coercive practices, rigid reporting protocols, owed much to their shared experiences. For them, the experience in the Gulag represented not only a shared rite of passage, almost pride, but also a deep process of enculturation about the values of coercion, incentive, and especially secrecy in institutional culture. And these were precisely the values and approaches, as some historians have argued, such as David Holloway, that allowed the Soviet Union to advance so rapidly in the early Cold War in key areas of science and technology. At the beginning of my talk, I posed the question about the social construction of Soviet science in this way. If the vicissitudes of Soviet polity and society explain the obvious failings of Soviet science, then they must also explain its successes. And indeed, we find that some of the traits that led to the tragedy of Lysenko and the retardation of disciplines such as cybernetics and many others contributed equally to the success of the first hydrogen bomb, the launch of Sputnik. Both emerged from a system of scientific work that depended on morally dubious underpinnings. The connections and tensions between freedom of science run through an entire generation of Soviet scientists and engineers, but it is not in the way we might understand it in the West. We see it especially in the life of Sergey Korolyov, the man whose biography I began the talk with. His life and aspirations as an engineer had been tragically interrupted by a spell in the Gulag. Freed from incarceration, Korolev recovered some of his youthful energy, but now tempered it with a hard dose of realism. He was a hard worker and drove others to work hard. After World War II, he joined a research team to design rockets and rose rapidly through the ranks. His skill attracted the attention of Soviet industrial managers who saw a man who was unsentimental and single-minded in his ambitions. And just 13 years after he left his prison science camp, in the fall of 1957, he stood in Central Asia as his brainchild, a giant rocket named the R-7, launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. Korolev made his mark on the history of science and technology, but he paid a steep price for it. Even after the launching of Sputnik, his identity was kept hidden from the public. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused to share credit for the spectacular achievements of the Soviet space program with the scientists and engineers in his pay. He kept them in the shadows. And here we see Korolev with the world's first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. This is in 1961. Korolev felt ambivalent about this imposed anonymity, perhaps even found it funny. He's said to have joked that the guards who protected him in his high position as the chief designer of the Soviet space program were probably the exact same ones who watched over him in the Gulag. In both periods, the guards had the same job, to serve as an immutable wall between the scientist and the outside world. The prison science system, like its parent, the Gulag, created walls within Soviet civil society that remained standing long after the Gulag itself was consigned to the scrap heap of history. Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, whose work benefited from Gulag slave labor, but who later became one of the most virulent critics of the communist regime, had much to say about science and secrecy. In fact, it is no surprise that one of his most famous lectures, given in Paris in 1990, as the Soviet Union itself was falling apart, was called Science and Freedom. I'd like to end with a quote from his speech, which seems apropos here. He wrote, "In about 10 years, the 20th century will be over. This was the century of 2 world wars and of many small wars, which took the life of millions. This was a century of the unseen before in the history of genocide. But at the same time, the 20th century possesses the feature which I consider extremely important. The 20th century was a century of science, of its great breakthrough." End of quote. Historians and philosophers of science have been grappling with this disturbing correlation, that some of the greatest advances in science and technology occurred simultaneously with some of the most egregious crimes against humanity. Sometimes the two went hand in hand, and as we saw in the Soviet case, sometimes one enabled the other. This is both the conundrum and tragedy of modern science, one that I hope we can declare useful and interesting only for historians. Thank you.